Hey guys, Travis Gillespie here. So let's look at this next example. We're asked to write the probability 75% as a decimal and a fraction. In fact, when you're working with probability, you can always choose to express the value as a percent, decimal, or fraction. Any of these three will work. So let's start with percent. I'm just going to write that symbol here for percents. I'm going to create a little bit of a table here. So I have percents. I'm going to put a little d for decimal and an f for fraction. And now I'm just going to create that table. And just going to bring it on down because I'm going to actually try to work through all three problems here. So let's start with this first one. We want to take 75%. So I'll plug 75% over here. I have 75% and I want to turn it into a decimal. Now there are a few different ways I can do this. The first way is to think of 75% as a part of a whole. Well, that's 75 out of the whole 100. So I could divide by 100 here. Let's just change colors. If I were to take 75 and think of it as 75 over 100, well, 75 over 100. Well, that looks like the same pen color. So let's undo that work real quick and go back to that. I wanted to use blue here. So 75 over 100. Well, what I'm really doing with 75 here is I'm dividing by 100. So this is the same as division by 100. So I'm just going to write down that I'm dividing by 100. And if I were to divide 75 by 100, I could use long division. Or I could just use a simple trick. There are two zeros in 100. That means I'm going to move the decimal when I have 75. Let's go back to my black pen real quick. Write 75 down. So right now, the start for 75%, the decimal is right here to the right of the 5. But we have two zeros in that value 100. I'm going to go back to the blue pen. And since I have two zeros for 100, I'm going to move this decimal two place values to the left. I'm moving to the left because I'm dividing by 100. I've got to make 75 smaller. So I've got to move this decimal from the right over to the left. So it will end up here before the 7. So a good thing to remember here, and it's kind of helpful, is that if you have a two-digit number, such as 7 and 5, since the decimal's starting here to the right of the 5, if you have a two-digit number, the decimal will always, when you're finished moving it and turning it from a percent to a decimal, it will always end up before that first number. So whenever you have a two-digit number, the decimal will be in front of that two-digit number if you turn the percent into a decimal. Now let's turn it into a fraction real quick. So I'm going to go back to 75% and turn it into a fraction. Well, we've already done that up here. It's 75 out of 100. I'm going to write that down. 75 out of 100. And I need to simplify this now. So if I were to ask myself what number goes into 75 and 100, well, there are a few that go into here, but the largest one to work with is 25. I'm going to change pen colors, and I'm going to simplify 100 by dividing by 25 on bottom. So I'm dividing by 25 on bottom. If I do it to the bottom, I've got to do the same thing to the top, so do it to the top. So divide by 25. Well, 75 divided by 25 gives us a value of 3. So let's write 3 down. 3. And 100 divided by 25 gives you a value of 4. So now we have our percent as 75. Our decimal, let me actually rewrite this decimal below. It should be 0.75. And our fraction is 3 over 4 here. All right, let's move on to the next problem. So here we're asked to write the probability of 0.8 as a fraction and a percent. So I'm just going to put 0.8 down first. And I want to turn 0.8 into a fraction. So I can ask myself, what place value is the 8 in? Well, it's in the 10th place value. So to write it as a fraction, I'm going to write it as 8 over 10 because it's in the 10th place value. But this needs to be simplified. So if I were to divide both 8 and 10 by the value 2, so if I divide the bottom by 2, I've got to do it to the top. Well, 10 divided by 2 gives us a value of 5. 8 divided by 2 gives a value of 4. And I can't simplify it any further from there. So this is our fraction. We have our decimal, which is 0.8. Let's turn this decimal into a percent. Well, earlier, I took the percent 75, I took this percent and turned it into a decimal. The way I did that was I divided by 100. I was moving from this section over to this. Now I've got to do the reverse here. I'm moving from this section in the opposite direction. So rather than dividing by 100, what do you think I'm going to do? I'm going to multiply by 100. Let's change pen colors again. So this time I'm going to multiply by 100 to move the decimal to the right this time. So I started with 0.8, but now I've got to move the decimal 2 place values to the right, 1, 2, and I'm going to fill this empty spot with a 0. The decimal will end here after that 0. The quick trick to remembering this is, since I'm multiplying by 100, there are 2 zeros in 100, I'll move that decimal 2 place values because there are 2 zeros in that 100. So let me rewrite that value as, let me change my pen color real quick, 80%. Now, let's pause for a second because you might be asking yourselves, well, how do I know if I need to move the decimal to the left or if I need to move the decimal to the right? Well, there's a kind of a mental trick here, mental math trick that I'm going to show you, is just remember that when you're looking at the percent of a value, if you're looking at the percent, it should look larger than the decimal. So let's just do this real quick. So the percent should look big when you compare it to its decimal value, so the decimal should look small. Maybe this will help us out. So let's think about 75% again. 75% should look big when compared to its decimal, which should look small. So let's think. If you have a big number and you want to make it small, should you divide by 100 or multiply by 100? Well, you should divide by 100 because you're trying to make it small. Let's go in the opposite direction now. If I have a decimal and I want to turn it into a percent, well then I've got to make that number big. So do I want to take 0.8, my decimal, and divide it by 100 or multiply by 100? Since I'm trying to take a small decimal and make it look big, I want to multiply by 100 to make it look big. 80% looks bigger than 0.8. But in reality, just remember that 80% is the same value as 0.8. These two are equivalent to each other. However, 80% looks bigger when you compare it to the decimal 0.8. Let's go ahead and work on our last problem here. This time we have the probability of 7 over 50. We want to write it as a decimal and a percent. So now I have my fraction, 7 over, let's fix that. Over 50. So now I need to turn this fraction into a decimal and a percent. Let's turn it into a decimal. One surefire way of always turning this fraction into a decimal, whatever fraction you're looking at, use long division. So the number in the numerator always goes inside the house. So 7 is inside the house. 50, in this case, the denominator, will be knocking on the door. Ask yourself, how many times does 50 go into 7? It doesn't go into 7, so I'll put an X down. Now I need to lay a 0 down inside the house. I need to add a number. But before I add that number, I've got to lay a decimal down inside the house and put a decimal up top. Alright, now I can put my 0 down and ask myself, how many times does 50 go into 70? It goes in 1 time. 1 times 50 gives me a value of 50. And now I can subtract 50 from 70. That gives me a value of 20. Alright, I'm going to put a 0 down and bring it down as well. So now I need to ask myself, how many times does 50 go into 200? It goes in 4 times. So 4 times 50 happens to be 200. I can subtract these two values and bottom out at 0 without a remainder. So my decimal looks like it's 0.14. So whenever you divide fractions, you can always find the decimal. There happens to be a shortcut just for this number because 50 happens to be a factor of another value, 100. So I can actually, if my denominator goes into 100, I can turn that denominator into 100. Let me show you how to do that. First off, I want to just create a little bit of an arrow. How do I turn 50 into 100? I've got to multiply 50 by the value 2. So 50 times 2 will give me a value of 100. But if I multiply the bottom value, 50, by 2, I've got to do the same thing to the top. So multiply the top by 2. Alright, I'm going to change colors back to black. We've already said 50 times 2 is 100. And 7 times 2 is 14. So if I'm looking at the part to the whole here, it's 14 out of 100. Well, that's like taking 14, the value 14, and dividing it by 100, which would also give us a value of 0.14. And I'm just going to write that value, that decimal, right here to the side. Now let's take 7/50 and turn it into a percent. Well, I can do this two ways. I can look at the decimal and ask myself, well, how do I make a small number big? Well, we can take this small number and multiply it by 100 like I did here. Since I'm going to make this small number big, I'm going to move the decimal 2 places to the right. Whenever you turn a decimal into a percent, you always move the decimal 2 places to the right. So you know that the final percent will be 14% here. There's also a quick way of doing this with the fraction. Since I have 14 out of 100, that's like if you had a test and you took a test and it just didn't do so well and you got 14 correct out of 100, you'd have a 14% on the test. But that's 14%. So the quick way of looking at it is as the part to the whole. If your whole is 100, then the number in the numerator will be your percent. In this case, it's 14%. Cool stuff, guys. I'll see you in another video.